Hello and welcome to Gravitas. With me, Priyanka Sharma. Let's get started.
Сегодня наши вооруженные силы, как уже говорил, действуют на линии боевого закрепления.
At a time when world leaders are gathering in New York to condemn the Ukraine war, Vladimir Putin has announced an immediate partial mobilization for Russian citizens. The Russian leader says that it is a necessary step to ensure Russia's territorial integrity. Let's be clear. This is the biggest escalation since the start of the war nearly 7 months ago. In fact, just a few minutes ago, we heard the US President Joe Biden condemned Russia's actions in Ukraine. And this is our cover story on Gravitas tonight. Stay with us and we'll try and decode what's Vladimir Putin's endgame.
Продовольствие, удобрений.
Last week, Vladimir Putin was assuring his allies. Remember that promise he made to Prime Minister Modi? The Russian president said, "We'll do everything to stop the war in Ukraine." It was a signal towards ending the war. Today, Putin spelled out his plans. It seems like he wants to end the war by doubling down. Nothing less than a victory will suffice for Putin. An accelerated war effort, a new mobilization campaign, and a veiled threat of using nuclear weapons. I repeat, nuclear weapons. The Russian president's address to the nation marked a turning point in the war today. And on Gravitas tonight, we'll decode Putin's next move. Last night, the Russian president kept everyone guessing. His address to the nation was delayed for several hours. It finally happened at 8 a.m. Moscow time. The Russian president, speaking from his office, informed the world about the next phase in his offensive in Ukraine. Listen in.
Namely to protect our homeland, its sovereignty and territorial integrity, to ensure the security of our people and people in the liberated territories. I consider it necessary to support the proposal of the Defense Ministry and of the General Staff to conduct a partial mobilization in the Russian Federation.
You heard him, a partial mobilization. What does that even mean? Russia's calling up its reserve forces. They'll be sent to the front line of the war. Russia has a vast reserve force. Around 25 million citizens are part of it. So how many are being called up for duty now? Just 300,000 for now. Let me repeat that. Just 300,000 soldiers out of a reserve force of 25 million. So clearly, this is not a full-scale mobilization. But it is still a rather significant escalation in this war. Putin said he has signed a decree. Only those with military experience are being called up. So what's driving his decision? Well, it is Putin's determination. The Russian president wants to stand up to the West. Putin's address was singularly targeted at Western powers. He accused the US and allies of blackmailing Russia. The Russian president says the West is trying to destroy his country.
The goal of the West is to weaken, divide and ultimately destroy our country. The West are saying directly that in 1991 they managed to split the Soviet Union, and now it's time to do the same with Russia.
Putin followed up that statement with some serious charges. He didn't present any evidence, however, but Putin claimed a nuclear strike on Russia will be acceptable for some NATO officials. He also blamed Ukraine for attacks near the nuclear power plant in Zaporizhia. Remember, Russian forces are in control of this plant. In recent weeks, the threat of a nuclear disaster there have grown. Russian and Ukrainian forces have been involved in clashes, with both sides blaming each other for an escalation. In fact, just today, Ukraine accused Russia of shelling the plant yet again. The United Nations has repeatedly called for a demilitarized zone there, but no one is willing to back down. And Putin's speech has only raised the stakes as of now. The Russian president reminded the world his country has nuclear weapons too. Listen in.
I want to remind those who allow themselves such statements about Russia that our country also has a variety of weapons of destruction, and in some areas even more modern than those in NATO countries. And if the territorial integrity of our country is threatened, we will without question use all the means at our disposal to protect Russia and our people. This is not a bluff.
This is not a bluff, he said. The Kremlin doesn't want to be taken for granted. Putin may have made the announcement now, but many had predicted that an escalation was coming. It was inevitable, they said. In fact, Moscow was already making preparations behind the scenes. A recruitment drive is already underway. Recruitment trucks have been spotted in Russia. They are looking for volunteer fighters. Military service on a contract, the choice of a real man. That's the sales pitch of the Russian forces. A recruitment drive is underway in Russian prisons too. Yes, convicted criminals are being recruited to fight in Ukraine. Russia's private military company, the Wagner Group, is said to be behind this effort. The Wagner Group has ties to the Kremlin, something we've reported on. Reports about recruitment in Russian prisons are not new. They have been floating around for a while now. But now, we have video evidence to corroborate this. Look at this. These pictures are from a Russian prison. The man in the center is believed to be from Wagner. He is making a pitch and asking prisoners to join in.
Я представитель частной военной компании. Наверное, слышали, ЧВК «Вагнер» называется. Война тяжелая. На всякие там чеченские и так далее близко не похоже. Расход боеприпасов у меня приблизительно в 2,5 раза больше, чем в Сталинграде. Минимальный возраст, который мы берем, это 22 года. Если моложе, бумажка от ближайших родственников, что они не против. Максимальный возраст условно, это 50 лет, но если крепкий, прямо здесь на собеседовании делаем элементарные тесты, смотрим, насколько крепок, физическая форма крайне необходима.
The signals are clear. The fighting will intensify in Ukraine. Ukraine is saying that Putin's escalation is an act of desperation. Meanwhile, leaders of Western countries have reacted more sharply. Reports say the European Union is now mulling more sanctions. But it seems that Emmanuel Macron still wants a peaceful resolution. The French president was speaking at the UN General Assembly. He endorsed Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's position. Take a look.
Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India, was right when he said the time is not for war. It is not for revenge against the West or for opposing the West against the East. It is the time for a collective time for our sovereign equal states to cope together with challenges we face. This is why there's an urgent need to develop a new contract between the North and the South, an effective contract.
Macron made an appeal for global unity, but there are only a few takers for his pitch. And as we've been reporting on, WION World is One. We just heard US President Joe Biden address the UN General Assembly. This was his second speech at the UN. In one word, it was combative. He began his speech by condemning Russia's war on Ukraine. He said one man, Vladimir Putin, was responsible for this war, adding that Putin was intent on wiping out Ukraine off the map. Listen in.
In the last year, our world has experienced great upheaval. A growing crisis in food insecurity, record heat, floods and droughts, COVID-19, inflation, and a brutal, needless war. A war chosen by one man, to be very blunt. Let us speak plainly. A permanent member of the United Nations Security Council invaded its neighbor, attempted to erase a sovereign state from the map. Russia has shamelessly violated the core tenets of the United Nations Charter. No more important than the clear prohibition against countries taking the territory of their neighbor by force.
The The US president also emphasized on the UN Charter, which was signed after the Second World War. The Charter guarantees principles like sovereignty and territorial integrity. Biden said that the US will continue to support and stand by Ukraine. He also called for a just end to the war based on Ukraine's demands. President Biden further rebutted claims made by Vladimir Putin on Tuesday. He said that no country had threatened Russia's security and that this war was in fact an act of unprovoked aggression. He called on all members of the United Nations to hold Russia accountable. Biden spent most of his time speaking about the war in Ukraine, but then he also touched upon the issue of United Nations reform. Biden asked permanent members of the Security Council to use the veto power more sparingly. He also supported its expansion to include more permanent and non-permanent members, including from Africa. Listen in.
I also believe the time has come for this institution to become more inclusive so that it can better respond to the needs of today's world. Members of the UN Security Council, including the United States, should consistently uphold and defend the UN Charter and refrain from the use of the veto, except in rare, extraordinary situations, to ensure that the Council remains credible and effective. That is also why the United States supports increasing the number of both permanent and non-permanent representatives of the Council. This includes permanent seats for those nations we have long supported and permanent seats for countries in Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean. The United States is committed to this vital work.
I want to talk about the bigger picture now. As combative as Biden's speech was, what does that change on ground? Whether it's the war in Ukraine or climate action or the food shortages. Despite these statements made at the UNGA, there has been very little progress when it comes to situation on ground. Which brings us to a larger question about the UN General Assembly itself. Is it really serving its purpose? Every year, dozens of global leaders descend on New York. They are allotted 15 minutes to address the Assembly. FYI, nobody cares about this time limit. Some leaders have spoken for hours. But what about the content of their address? That's what matters, you would assume. Is it focused on solving global issues? Or is it just a glorified campaign stunt? Let's now take a look at what the United Nations says. The general debate of the United Nations General Assembly is the opportunity for heads of state and government to come together at the UN headquarters and discuss world issues. Let me repeat that last part for all of you, to discuss world issues. And to be honest, there is an endless list of things to talk about. There is a war in Ukraine. There is a civil war in Ethiopia. There is genocide in Xinjiang. There is fighting in Yemen and Libya, and a pandemic that refuses to go away. You would think that world leaders are brimming with ideas. Think again. Most of them are using the UNGA as a platform to boost their own popularity. Case in point, Jair Bolsonaro. Let's talk about him. The Brazilian president faces a tough election next month. So what does he do? Kick off his campaign at the UN General Assembly. Listen to this.
Under my administration, we uprooted the systemic corruption that existed in the country. I am pleased to announce that we have had unprecedented deflation in Brazil in the months of July and August this year. Domestically, we also have record breakers in 3 areas: tax collection, state-owned company profit levels, and the public debt to GDP ratio.
My question is quite simple. What does any of that have to do with the UN? Brazil's inflation is apparently low, great for Bolsonaro. But how does that affect the rest of the world? He says he has rooted out corruption. Again, great for Bolsonaro. But how does that solve geopolitical conflicts? And finally, record tax collection. Frankly, I'm lost for words. How is Brazil's tax collection a relevant issue at the UN? I told you, the motive or the agenda is to discuss world issues. The answer is it's not. Bolsonaro's entire address was a campaign speech. He touched upon the Ukraine war briefly, but after that, he only talked about his own agenda, his own government. In fact, that was the plan all along. Before landing in New York, the Brazilian president was in London. He was attending the Queen's funeral. But during his stay, Bolsonaro managed to shoot this video. You can see him standing at a gas station in London. He says, Fuel is much cheaper in Brazil than in Britain. Just let that sink in. He was attending a funeral for Queen Elizabeth II, but he found time for a campaign detour. Now, don't get me wrong. Bolsonaro isn't the only leader doing this. Over the years, the UNGA podium has lost its relevance. Leaders don't offer solutions anymore. They praise themselves and their government. Makes you wonder, what's the point of this pretense? If the idea is to create a glorified campaigning stage, the UN may as well wind it up. Frankly, it's become an annual exercise of the 3 C's: campaign, complain, and criticize. But still, several global leaders are addressing the UNGA in New York. They are going to tackle big issues: climate change, the Ukraine war, inflation, and many other issues. And WION will be going live with all the updates on our YouTube channel, so you can head there for the latest. For now, I'd like to move on. If some leaders are using the UNGA to pitch for re-election, others are using it to meddle in foreign conflicts. Case in point, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. It's an old habit of his. Erdogan rattles out his opinion on every conflict at the General Assembly. But just one problem. No one has ever asked for it. This year too, he did exactly that. Erdogan raised the issue of Kashmir during his address. Listen to this.
India and Pakistan, after having established their sovereignty and independence 75 years ago, they still haven't established peace and solidarity between one another. And this is much unfortunate. We hope and pray that a fair and a permanent peace and prosperity will be established in Kashmir.
Two ways of looking at this. Number one, Erdogan has no business commenting on Kashmir. It is a bilateral issue between India and Pakistan. So Turkey does not have a stake. Number two, how does this statement compare to Erdogan's past remarks? Time for a short history lesson. In 2019, Erdogan openly criticized India. He said that Kashmir residents were living under a virtual blockade. In 2020, he called it a burning issue. Remember, this is after the Indian government abrogated Kashmir statehood. Erdogan said that the move complicated matters. Finally, in 2021, he talked about UN resolutions. He said the conflict must be resolved through the United Nations. Which brings us to the present, to 2022. No mention of blockades, no comment on Kashmir statehood. Instead, Erdogan made a rather broad remark. He said he prayed for permanent peace and prosperity in Kashmir. And that's not all. He said that it's up to India and Pakistan to resolve it. In other words, he admitted that it is in fact a bilateral issue, not some rallying call for the Muslim world. But the question is, how should India receive this? Two factors will influence New Delhi's thinking. One is the wording. In diplomacy, semantics are extremely important. While virtual blockade is a hostile statement, praying for peace is relatively better. Not ideal, but certainly better. Second, the backdrop of Erdogan's address. Last week, the Turkish president was in Uzbekistan for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. He held a meeting there with Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Now, this meeting was a surprise. It was not part of Prime Minister Modi's schedule. Neither was it mentioned by the Turkish government. It signaled an attempt to reset ties between New Delhi and Ankara. Things have spiraled since 2019. Erdogan had drawn up grand plans to lead the Islamic world, and for that, he chose Kashmir as a rallying point. He turned it into a core issue to unite all Muslim nations. Needless to say, he failed. But in the last 3 years, Turkey's economy has suffered. That brings me to my next point. So Erdogan is rebuilding all the bridges that he had burned. With Israel, with Saudi Arabia, with the UAE, and now perhaps with India. So there is reason to believe that Erdogan is climbing down from his radical position. Having said that, India must still be wary. After all, Kashmir is a bilateral issue. No world leader has any business talking about it at the General Assembly. So guess what New Delhi did? A bit of tit-for-tat diplomacy, as they say. External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar met his Turkish counterpart on Tuesday. They talked about a wide range of issues: the war in Ukraine, the food crisis, India's G20 presidency, and also Cyprus. Now, that last topic is a rather sensitive one for Turkey. Let me explain. Cyprus is an island in the Mediterranean Sea. In 1974, Turkey invaded the northern part of the island. They created a breakaway region called Northern Cyprus. Only one country in the world recognizes them. Guess which one? Turkey themselves. India's position on this conflict has been consistent from day one. It must be resolved based on United Nations resolutions. So this tit-for-tat diplomacy isn't exactly new. In 2019, Prime Minister Modi met with the President of Cyprus, and that meeting too was on the sidelines of the UNGA. Prime Minister Modi reiterated India's support for Cypriot independence and integrity. A clear indictment of Turkey. The bottom line is this: India must be wary. Yes, Erdogan's statements hint at a climb down of sorts, but remember whom we are talking about. One of the most ambitious and ruthless leaders on the world stage. Erdogan's circumstances are forcing him to reset ties with the world. His economy is stagnating. He faces re-election next year, so he has no option but to repair relations. But knowing Erdogan, this isn't an ideological pivot. This is simply political convenience. And that is also a charge the president of Nepal currently faces: political convenience. She is being accused of trying to derail a bill, a crucial bill, to suit the interests of her own political party. The bill in question concerns granting citizenship to certain foreigners. The government is fine with it, but the president is not. She has rejected the bill twice, and this has triggered an all-out political battle. The ruling party is accusing the president of abusing her power and trying to trigger a constitutional crisis. Our next report gets you all the details. Nepal is in the grip of another political crisis. A tussle between the country's rulers. On one side is the president, a constitutional post with no executive powers. On the other side is the government, the Prime Minister along with his cabinet. So what is this tussle all about? A citizenship amendment bill. It has been passed by both houses of the parliament, but the president is refusing to ratify it. The first rejection came on the 16th of August. President Vidya Devi Bhandari sent the bill back to Nepal's lower house along with a list of changes and suggestions. On August 18th, the government's lower house held a vote. It approved the bill once again and sent it back to the president, only to receive another snub. Another presidential dismissal. Reports say that this time Vidya Devi Bhandari deliberately missed the deadline and chose not to acknowledge the bill, forget ratifying it. Her actions have sparked a fresh backlash. She is being accused of abusing her power. A statement by the Nepalese government reads, "This unconstitutional move by the president has grossly insulted and devalued the federal parliament elected by the people." That's not all. The youth wings of ruling coalition parties, mainly the Maoists and the Nepali Congress, are seeking the Nepalese president's exit. And to drive the message home, they also plan to stage nationwide demonstrations.
Stateless youth in Kathmandu, Nepal are staging protests against President Bhandari's decision to not certify the citizenship bill. They're accusing her of taking away their constitutional rights and are demanding president's resignation. Just a while ago, the coalition leaders issued a joint statement terming the decision, the step of the President Bhandari's, as unconstitutional. We know that there has been differences between the Prime Minister's office and the President. After the disapproval of the bill, now there's an open confrontation between the President's office and the Prime Minister.
So what explains the Nepalese president's apprehensions? Why exactly is she refusing to ratify the bill? Well, reports claim that she's against certain provisions of this bill. The first one is a citizenship provision for foreign women. This bill grants them the right to acquire citizenship immediately after marrying a Nepalese citizen. The second provision concerns citizenship to children whose parents' whereabouts are unknown. Under this amendment, children born to a Nepali mother who have no idea about their father could get citizenship on the mother's request. These changes would have entitled more than 500,000 people to citizenship certificates and eventually granted them voting rights. But the president doesn't like the sound of this. She says such a bill could threaten Nepal's interests. Her critics say she's only trying to secure the interests of her own party. the Communist Party of Nepal, or CPN. Led by Nepal's former Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli, they're being slammed for trying to use the bill for political ends. You see, in 2 months from now, Nepal will head to polls. And the CPN's prospects don't look too good. The party is trailing in every opinion poll. So is it trying to orchestrate a constitutional crisis simply for electoral gains? Who knows? Bureau Report, WION World is One. Meanwhile, in West Asia, Iran is stirring up fresh tensions by reviving an old territorial claim. In recent weeks, the Iranian media has been pushing a claim. Bahrain is not an independent country. Instead, it is the 14th province of Iran, it says. You heard that right. Iran is taking claim to an independent and sovereign Bahrain. They call Bahrain the province of Miss Mahig. What gives? Now, before we move further, let me answer the most obvious question. Is there any merit to this claim? The answer is no. Bahrain is not a part of Iran. Bahrain is an independent nation. There are no doubts over its sovereignty. Then what are these claims all about? Let me explain. In the year 1957, under the Shah, Iran had laid a claim on Bahrain. At that time, Bahrain was a British protectorate. But Iran staked a claim over it anyway. A bill was passed in the Iranian parliament in the year 1957. It declared Bahrain as Iran's 14th province. 2 seats were also created for Bahrain in Iran's parliament, but they were never claimed. Bahrain got its independence from the British rule in 1971. But 1 year before that, in 1970, the United Nations conducted a plebiscite there. The question before Bahrainians was simple. Will they accept Iran's rule or do they want independence? The Bahrainis overwhelmingly chose independence. The United Nations Security Council had passed a resolution then. It talks about the final result of the plebiscite. Listen to this. The overwhelming majority of the people of Bahrain wish to gain recognition of their identity in a fully independent and sovereign state, free to decide for itself its relations with other states. Iran had to accept the outcome. So in 1971, they also recognized Bahrain as a sovereign state. But in the years that followed, Iranian officials kept coming up with different reasons to question Bahrain's independence. And one of the most recent instances was this one. It happened in the year 2018. A representative of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, made a controversial remark. His name is Hossein Shariatmadari. He had said that Iran owns Bahrain and the people of Bahrain feel separated from their motherland. Listen to this quote now. Once we wrote that Bahrain is ours, many made lots of noise. Saudi muftis who say too much nonsense issued a death fatwa against us. That claim led to protests. Bahrain had demanded an apology too. The controversy quickly died down, but now it is being revived. Already, Iran and Bahrain have a tense relationship. One of the reasons for that is Israel. In 2020, Bahrain normalized diplomatic ties with Israel. In February this year, both the countries signed a security pact. And this week, they kicked off talks for a free trade agreement. Remember, Israel is an arch rival of Iran, so Tehran will not be too happy about the deepening ties, naturally. But attacking Bahrain, Iran is also taking on a key US ally. Bahrain is critical to American interests in the region. It hosts the 5th fleet of the US Navy. So Iran could also be targeting the US by reviving these very claims. The verbal attacks on Bahrain are now intensifying. Last month, on Bahrain's Independence Day, the Iranian press carried a series of pieces. They all questioned the independence of Bahrain. Even Iran's Revolutionary Guards have jumped onto the narrative, onto the debate. The Revolutionary Guards run the Fars news agency. It republished a controversial editorial from 2007. Again, it questions the independence of Bahrain and calls for an Iranian takeover. Listen to this now. Today, the main demand of the people of Bahrain is the return of this province, which was severed from Iran back to its original and maternal land, meaning Islamic Iran. Well, such moves will only needle Bahrain further and escalate the risk of raising tensions in an already volatile region. Let's move on to our next story now and talk about the never-ending debate around money and happiness. Many would say that money can buy you happiness. Well, guess what? If that was true, America would not be in the middle of a mental health epidemic. We'll talk about this more now. What if I told you that the world's richest country is also one of the world's most anxious and the most depressed countries? I'm still talking about the United States of America. Such is the crisis there that all American adults may soon have to undergo an anxiety disorder checkup. So how's that going to work? You know, when you go to your doctor, she checks for blood pressure, heart rate, etc. In America, doctors may soon also be checking for anxiety. The obvious question is why? Well, because anxiety numbers have touched sky high. Let me show you. Between August 2020 and February 2021, adults showing recent symptoms of anxiety increased 41.5%. Earlier, the number would be 36.4%. Do you see the difference there, the increase? So it makes sense that a government-backed expert panel has now recommended that all adults under the age of 65 should be scanned for anxiety disorders. Whether or not the administration of Joe Biden will welcome this recommendation is, of course, another story. But either way, it does not take away the seriousness of this crisis. First things first, anxiety is no stranger to America. According to one particular estimate, 40% of American women and 25% of American men suffer from anxiety sometime or the other in their lifetime. Again, the obvious question is why? Why are Americans so anxious? Currently, that's because of a plethora of reasons. There's inflation. Cost of living is up 8.3%. A loaf of bread in America is now 16.4% more expensive. Eggs, 39.8%. Let's talk about reason number 2. There is a rise in crime rates. On this show, we have repeatedly talked about America's problem with gun terror. Well, it has only worsened over the last 2 years. 2022 began with an 11-month-old baby being shot in the face. It happened in the Bronx in New York. This was on the 20th of January. The homicide numbers for the first half of 2022 are 39% higher than they were back in 2019 or pre-pandemic years. And this is according to the US Council on Criminal Justice. Aggravated assault has gone up. So have robberies. Property crimes are also up, as are residential burglaries. You see, fear adds to anxiety. But here's what has likely been the biggest contributor. The Wuhan virus pandemic. It has claimed more than 1 million lives in America and infected more than 94 million others. Today, Americans, like people in all other countries, are scared to fall ill. There is also the fear of losing loved ones to the Wuhan virus. Some of these feelings, of course, are universal. Some of these feelings are relatable for all of us, but not all though. You may currently be watching me from a country where crime rates are low or inflation is in check. But the pandemic, well, that has taken a toll on all of us. The uncertainty around it, the overwhelming sense of fear, somewhere, that has consumed most of us today. The World Health Organization found that during the first year of the pandemic, anxiety and depression increased by 25% globally, 25%. In America, like we told you, it increased over 41%. Experts are obviously concerned. As early as April this year, they were pushing for a preventive approach. Back in April, the same government-backed panel recommended anxiety screening for children and adolescents aged between 8 and 18 years. You see, anxiety has rather unique ways of expressing itself. Sometimes, children with anxiety may repeatedly complain of stomach aches or headaches. People with anxiety have difficulty focusing. It's something to watch out for. They get easily irritated. They have difficulty sleeping or controlling an overwhelming sense of worry. People with anxiety also almost always feel tired or fatigued. What's more, anxiety comes with a huge cost. For starters, it sabotages your work performance. It also takes a toll on your social interaction with your family, friends, your peers. And obviously, it goes on to affect your mental health. It's not just the person, but also her country that pays the price of this anxiety. According to The Lancet, poor mental health costs the world $2.5 trillion per year. And this is in poor health and reduced productivity, something we just spoke about. By 2030, this number is expected to touch $6 trillion a year. I repeat, $6 trillion a year. Look at those shocking figures. The solution to this problem begins with prevention, and that's what the US is trying to focus on as of now. It's a priority. It is looking to screen children, adolescents and adults for anxiety. But this is just the start of a long battle. And the next and most obvious move would be to address the cause, the root cause of anxiety. And this would include answering some uncomfortable questions for all of us, be it around crime rates and gun laws, specific to America, or how America, with all its wealth, is failing to make Americans happy. That is something to think about for all of us. Which now brings me to a rather shocking story. We often turn to the internet for laughs, for distraction, for inspiration. A simple search and there seems to be an easy answer to all your problems. We love to watch people try out new experiments, new trends, and feel inspired to try them out ourselves. But off late, certain DIY or do-it-yourself trends are going viral, which are essentially a recipe for danger. One such fad is teaching you how to cook chicken in cough syrup. I repeat, in cough syrup. I don't know who needs to hear this, but this is dangerous. Don't try this at home. Here's why.
The internet is a weird place. It can help you stay informed. But sometimes it can also make you question your sanity. Take this latest internet fad, for instance. What you just saw was chicken being cooked in a NyQuil jacuzzi. For the unversed, NyQuil is a cough syrup used for a common cold. It often causes drowsiness in one's body. But thanks to the creativity of some TikTokers, NyQuil has become an alternative for cooking oil. It is being used to make sleepy chicken. Before we tell you about this strange concoction, let's be clear, do not try this at home. The recipe is quite simple and dangerous. Take a slice of chicken and drench it in NyQuil, yes, the cough syrup, and you let it simmer. The NyQuil Chicken Challenge is going viral, with people sharing their own unique recipes. But the trend's growing popularity has unnerved many health experts, even the ones at America's Food and Drug Administration, FDA. It has called the trend a recipe for danger and is requesting people to not fall for it. The warning reads, the challenge sounds silly and unappetizing, and it is, but it could also be very unsafe. Boiling a medication can make it much more concentrated and change its properties in other ways. It could also hurt your lungs. The warning is without reason, because there is no medical basis to this recipe. There's no saying either if the people promoting it are joking or really consuming this grotesque meal. Whatever be the case, the petrifying blue color of the chicken should be enough to make you reconsider. Interestingly, this is not the first time a social media challenge has gone off the rail. Before the NyQuil Chicken Challenge, there was the Benadryl Challenge. It encouraged people to take large doses of Benadryl to induce hallucinations. A 15-year-old's attempt to do so resulted in her death. There was also the Tide Pod Challenge, another unappetizing trend. As the name indicates, it involved the consumption of Tide Pods that are originally used to clean laundry. This trend resulted in at least 10 deaths and caused more than 37 poisoning cases. But despite such scary precedents, you still have challenges like the sleepy chicken going viral. It truly makes you wonder if it's time to press the restart button on this world.
If you think about it, a lot of these TikTok trends have gone viral because people in general had more time to kill during the pandemic. It began with viral Dalgona coffee and banana breads, and the TikTok recipes never stopped. Goes without saying, TikTok benefited from the pandemic. You know what else did? Video games. Like TikTok, video games are seemingly harmless. But what happens once you indulge in them is anybody's guess. Our last story tonight on Gravitas is about video gaming. How many of you know someone who spends day in and day out locked in a room, gaming? You know, when you walk into his room, the person is sitting with his headset on. He has a controller in hand and is busy racing cars or killing zombies, perhaps. I'm guessing the person you have in mind is a boy in his late teens or adolescent years, maybe even an adult. For some reason, video gaming finds more takers among men than women, which is also the reason for our choice of pronoun for this story today. Now, coming to the reason why we decided on it. While a lot has been said about video gaming in recent days and how it has benefited from the pandemic, there is an urgent need to highlight the other side of this story, and that is the problems of video gaming. What happens when people spend too much time gaming? Well, a new research has linked video games to cyber aggression. It says a child who plays violent games could also display problematic behavior online. Think about that. What exactly do we mean by cyber aggression? This is when a person intentionally intimidates someone else online. It could be through threats or by exerting power. Now, this research also says that a person who is killing enemies in his video games is more likely to display the same kind of aggression online. Violent video games are just a part of the problem. Experts have linked video games to unmotivated boys, even underachieving young men. They say video games often play a big role in pulling a person off track. In other words, it takes a huge toll on your performance in school and work. And then, of course, there is the whole problem of video game addiction, something we've touched upon. How do you tell addiction from a harmless weekend indulgence? Gaming becomes a problem when a person prioritizes video games over everything else in their life, or when gaming starts taking precedence over other activities. Very so often, the person realizes that his gaming habits are affecting his school, his work, family life, social relationships, health, and even hygiene. And yet he continues gaming. That is addiction, and it's scary. Research shows that some children are at higher risk of this addiction. So who are these children? Loners, and those who are socially excluded. Now, the pandemic forced all of us into social exclusion. Many found comfort in video games, distraction perhaps. Naturally, sales shot up. As early as March 2020, sales were up 35% year-on-year. The industry could not be happier. 2 years into the pandemic, we may now be staring at the flip side of this pandemic indulgence. And it is a problem the scale of which we are yet to comprehend. Much like long COVID or TikTok viral trends, we don't know the extent to which they will be harmful for us in the future. There are some classic symptoms that will help you tell if a person is slowly becoming addicted to gaming. 1. The games are displacing his social life. Say, your child isn't doing his homework because he's spending too much time gaming. Or your friend is not showing up for social scenes, social commitments. Again, because he is gaming. Let me tell you about symptom number 2, lying. Your child just told you he wasn't gaming when you were away, but you know for a fact that he was. 3, anger or irritability. Your child gets angry easily if you tell him he can't game for more than an hour or 2 a day. That's another telltale classic sign, as they say, that your child may be getting addicted to gaming, or that you need to keep an eye out for these symptoms. You see, video games have been around for quite some time now, but never has their presence been so menacing. The world's first video game was created in 1958. In the 1970s, Pong was released. It was the first video game to go viral. And this year, we celebrate the 50th anniversary of Pong. In the last 50 years or so, video games have changed drastically. For starters, the very medium has changed. From computers to PlayStations, Xbox, and now, of course, mobile phones. Games are everywhere. The very nature of gaming has changed. Today, it is not only a recreation, but also a profession, an addiction, and a growing threat. One that the world can't afford to ignore anymore. And now let's move on and tell you what else made news around the world. Time now for Gravitas Global Headlines.
At least 8 people, including a member of the security forces, have been killed in Iran during unrest sweeping the country, as anger over the death of a woman in morality police custody continues to mount. The Taiwanese government says it will never allow China to meddle in its future, after Beijing says it was willing to make the utmost effort to strive for a peaceful reunification with the island. Britain unveils a 6-month plan starting in October to pay about half of the energy bills for businesses as Prime Minister Liz Truss tackles the soaring cost of living crisis. Angelina Jolie, the actor who has been the special envoy to the United Nations for refugees, visited flood-hit areas in Pakistan to provide help to those affected. Reports say at least 300 people have died from waterborne diseases in flood-hit areas so far. Hundreds of Filipino activists took to the streets to mark the 50th anniversary of the late strongman Ferdinand Marcos Sr.'s declaration of martial law. Activists chanted "Never forget" and held banners condemning the crimes allegedly committed by the regime, including extrajudicial killings, human rights abuses, and forced disappearances. About 230 pilot whales found stranded on the coast of the Australian island of Tasmania, at the same site where the country's largest ever stranding took place 2 years ago. iPhone maker Apple said it will raise prices of apps and in-app purchases on its App Store from next month in all of the Eurozone and some countries in Asia and South America. This will be effective as early as October 5th. A United States astronaut and 2 Russian cosmonauts blasted off to the International Space Station on a Russian-operated flight, in a rare instance of cooperation between Moscow and Washington. Roger Federer, who announced last week that he would retire from professional tennis after the Lever Cup, says partnering his great rival Rafael would be the ideal way to end his storied career. Alex Hales marked his return to international cricket with a well-made 53, while debutant Luke Wood took 3 wickets as England claimed a 6-wicket 2020 win over Pakistan in their first game in the country for 17 years.
And with that, it's a wrap on Gravitas. Thanks for watching the show with me, Priyanka Sharma. We leave you, as always, with Gravitas images. Stay tuned to WION World is One.